a tendency to building castles in the air.
Hello, and welcome back to Place of Assembly. This is your host, Sam Hilmer. Place of Assembly is the podcast where we look at the role of physical space in cultural production. Place of Assembly is produced by Hollow NYC in partnership with Experimental Sound Studio Chicago and 8-Ball Radio. We are on the fourth episode of a four-part series, The Arts Emergence in Upstate New York, co-hosted by Melissa Maur and co-presented by her venue, Basilica Hudson. This week we have a formidable roundtable of actors from young arts organizations in Hudson, New York. Melissa, who have you brought on for this today?
So the Place of Assembly, on our final episode of our Hudson Valley tour, is the City of Hudson itself. By contrast of the first two organizations, or three organizations that we took a deep dive in, that are sort of established organizations of art in Upstate, these are three emerging new organizations and in Hudson that one, for example, is the Hudson Eye, and the founder, Jonah Becker, who's also the founder of his own Jonah Becker Foundation. He's a choreographer, but for the last 2 years, and this year will be the third edition, the Hudson Eye has been a 2-week citywide art festival, primarily focusing on local and free, but also to empower local venues. So the Hudson Art Fair is a newly organized art space in Hudson, and then not to be mistaken with the Hudson Art Fair. So the Hudson Art Fair is born, I think, during the pandemic. We'll hear a little bit more by artist and gallery owner Ellen Darcy Simpson and David McIntyre, who seem to be organizers of the Hudson Art Fair, but it really is connecting arts and activism and how artists can help causes in the city of Hudson, specifically in and around and birthed around the pandemic. And then the third dynamic duo, Carrie Sept, who's the co-founder, actually I think founder and executive director of the 10th magazine, along with managing director James Powell. And the 10th magazine, interesting in terms of space of assembly, is it's a print publication online, entering into the city of Hudson now with a radio show. They've also had an event element, and actually formed recently a 10th Academy. So we're talking about lots of different ways that people hold space, and I feel like I'm going to learn a lot about the new and future Hudson based on listening to three really committed, generous, dynamic, and quite different organizations that are taking root in Hudson. So let's see what they have to say.
Yeah, excited to get into it. Here we go. What's up? How's everybody?
Hey, doing good.
Springy.
This is the largest gathering we've had on Place of Assembly. There's 7 of us. It's formidable. So
because it's the gigantic city of Hudson. It's the less than 7,000 person city that requires so many people to represent it. It's good.
The towering metropolis. So as not to prolong a state of confusion about who all of you are, I'm going to dive into the Place of Assembly question. And since there are so many of you in this case, each of you give a kind of elevator pitch, brief answer to this question. But before you do, say your name, what organization you're from, and a little take on your organization to ground our viewers in a sense of who each of you are. So, and then, yeah, everybody, we'll just do it Quaker style. Everybody can just kind of jump in when there's a silence, and we'll see who answers. So the question is, what is the craziest or most intense or most ecstatic event that you've ever been a part of wherein you have had some level of responsibility for what's happening? You could be running it, you could have, brought some of the talent or just working the door or something, but you're not just an attendee. You're there in some capacity, you're a part of the event.
Jonah.
I think it's all of the independent space in Hudson, and especially prior to COVID, although I know we all love talking about COVID. Prior to COVID, this river town was booming with independent space and still is, but I had this kind of transcendent experience with like a DJ set in Hudson, and just how it wasn't promoted, just everybody trickled in, and that party was so lit and transcendent. So
amazing. But tell us your organization and your name, and do the calling card.
Oh, pardon me. I was doing the Quaker. I was feeling your spirit. Cool. So my name is Jonah Beaucaire, and after falling in love with the city of Hudson, much like my Hudson sister Melissa has, I think, I tried to create what I think is an ode to Hudson every year, and we attempt in the friendliest of possible ways. We attempt to do a citywide festival, but it's pretty small. It's like a week long around Labor Day, and the love around that, it is called the Hudson Eye, and we do local artists and local venues, and we try to steer love.
Cool. All right. Who's next?
I'll go next.
Do it.
So you said one of our most, because I always need to ask twice, one of the most gnarliest events that we've been a part of, does it have to be Hudson based, or is this just our whole entire life?
Anywhere.
Yeah, I'm gonna take it back to high school, actually. When I was in high school, I grew up in, my name is James Powell, by the way, and I'm the managing editor for 10th Magazine. And I grew up in right outside of Richmond, Virginia, in Chesterfield County. So that came with a lot of benefits and also some challenges. But the high school I was going to at the time did not have a lot of programming that was dedicated to learning about people of color in our school. So I took it upon myself to be a bit of a rebel and started what's called the African American Literary Society. And it actually was focusing on literature by artists that were not represented in the curriculum that was being taught in our English literature classes. So I actually went a step further, and we ended up having a whole Black History Month program that was mandatory for our entire school to go to. And I remember what was sort of crazy about it is because I had teachers that I really looked up to who boycotted the event because they felt like, we should not only be focusing on Black history, and this is, my drama teacher was like, I'm not going, but it was just how the whole student body, including the principal and the parents, all really worked together and thought this was incredible. And it started this wave of all the other, like Latinx, indigenous people all started to want to have their own mandatory assemblies. And our teachers started to revisit the curriculum. And I think that was the first time that I said, if there is something that is missing, we can be change agents, and not only change agents within our own communities, but actually activate others who feel silence. And I think it's experience like those that have largely influenced the work that I'm doing now, and has given me sort of this, I don't want to say fearlessness, but you do have to have a little bit of no fear when you're going to space and saying, I need to be heard, because I realize I'm working on behalf of everyone, not just me, not just my community, but everyone who is being silent. So that's just sort of, I would say, one of, besides the many raves that I've been to in the country, this was probably one of the craziest things I did, because it really did cause a stir at my school.
Amazing.
And I was a lot younger and more beautiful and all those things.
James, where was that? Where did you go to high school? Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Chesterfield County, Virginia. So it's about, it's right outside of Richmond, which is maybe 2 hours away from Washington, D.C., which is where we had all the riots this summer when they were taking down the Confederate monuments that literally were inundated in my community. I mean, every neighborhood was named Plantation, Estate, Colony, this. It's really just a part of the culture. So to see that happen was just so incredible. And like I said, it really largely influenced the work that I'm doing now. To just be, try to be as brave as possible.
Amazing.
And I can throw the baton to someone.
Throw the baton.
I think I'm gonna pass it to Melissa because I want to pass it to you.
Oh, that is so nice that I was just going to be a listener, and I already answered this question, but I will tell you two things because I had to pick between one. One was when I was a young girl on stage and Courtney Love's shoe got thrown to my head, almost concussioned, got taken away by an ambulance, and the band continued on. And as my head was going like I thought maybe I was permanently damaged because she had stage dived, lost all of her clothes, lost everything, and then came back up naked and was like, my shoe, my favorite shoe. And then I just remember coming. And I remember at that moment realizing, oh, that bass player, which I'd always said is the mother of all instruments. You never notice she's there, but you kind of hope that you notice if she's gone. But I was like, they don't even notice I'm gone. The bass player has gone to the hospital and nobody stopped playing. That was one. And then the other is actually, because I wanted to bring it to Hudson too, which is our first 24-hour drone, it came from a dream I had when I was a teenager of the power of sound melting boundaries of time, space, and people, and a gift from the gods to travel through a morphed group of people. And that's why I founded the Basilica, was to try to imagine that concept. And it was very abstract thing to try to pull off the first year. And there was there was only about one person who was with me the whole time who really believed it would happen and work. And it's to this day, one of the most important events I am part of. And of course, I'm mourning the fact that it has not happened during the pandemic, because I guess 600 people sleeping an inch apart from each other for 24 hours is not pandemic friendly. Although those are the two that, for me came quick when Sam asked the question I wasn't prepared to answer. But how about Ellen? How about
Okay. I'm so nervous. This is my first podcast. So by the way, bass is my favorite instrument, Melissa. So I always hear it in all the bands I go to. And thanks everybody. So nice to meet all of you. Love all of your work. So the craziest thing I've ever done is what I'm doing in Hudson right now. I, a couple of years ago, had this epiphany. I lived in northern New Jersey where I raised my kids. My husband and I lived in the suburbs for the 18 years that we were raising our kids. Before that, we lived in Europe. We lived in Amsterdam and London. My first daughter was born in London. And before that, Williamsburg, Brooklyn. And it was just kind of this journey to suburbia, raising kids in this area. And it was fine. My husband's business got bought out. He was looking for a job. I was looking for a job. My background was marketing and PR. And the more we looked for kind of to continue the life and the path we were on, the more kind of depressed and angry and kind of icky our moods became. And my husband's always been a painter. I've always sold my friends' art. We've always loved Hudson. And one day I said, you know what? Let's change everything. And we got in our car, we drove to Hudson, which we just always had a fantasy about. We didn't even think about what we ended up doing. We didn't even dare to dream where we are now, but we just drove to Hudson to look to do a pop-up art gallery. And we found a space. And that day I called the realtor, the owner of the building. I signed a lease, and I hung my husband's art. I had other friends that had art. And I started driving from New Jersey every weekend, and sat in this little beautiful slice of heaven and opened the doors and just dove in headfirst to this unknown world, and discovered what like my true calling was, my happiness. I was so scared every day. I didn't know what I was doing, still don't. And just every day learned more than I had learned ever. And just pivoting and changing my mind and fucking up and just figuring things out, trying to make a living, trying to be around art, trying to write about art, think about art. It was my obsession in my past life was art. And then a crooked path led me back. And I'm here now, like after a few years of doing this, and I just can't believe the conversations I have every day. I can't believe the people I'm around. I'm inspired all the time. And I'm a little bit in over my head, but my nose and mouth are just, getting the air, and I'm feeling my way. And I was so lucky. So I have my gallery. So my name's Ellen Darcy Simpson. I have a gallery on Warren Street called Darcy Simpson Artworks. And it showcases local, like Hudson Valley artists, art that I love and believe in. And so that's the craziest thing I ever did, is what I'm doing now. But I was so lucky to meet David and work on an activist art show with David that just blew everything up for me and set me on this path of activist art. And anyway, I guess we'll talk about that later, but I'm sorry to ramble on, but that's my answer.
Excellent. So, David.
Well,
Hi, I'm David McIntyre. I am the founder of Hudson Art Fair, which curiously started as an online venue. So the conversation about space is kind of going to be really interesting. But we launched it because there was no space during the lockdown, together with 10 other local artists. We got together, and it was just to create a space when the galleries were closed, a space when there was no space. And we ran that all through the summer. And then in the fall, we did a show, as Ellen mentioned, Jewel the Wound, which was a collaboration online, offline. And we the online space was the Hudson Milliner Art Salon. And that was just an awesome experience. And I think Ellen came in and worked on that. Doing publicity, community outreach. It was just, we formed a really great bond. Just, we understand each other. We're yin and yang. No, we're two yings, I think, actually. Anyway, and it was a wonderful success. And it led, as Melissa knows, it led to a chronogram conversation series in which we talked about getting art out of the gallery into more public spaces, or at least getting the message out of the gallery. Because when you're dealing with activist art, the gallery is kind of like the worst place for it to be, because you're always just preaching to the choir. And that's how I came to be on this podcast. So stories, it was about an event, right?
Mm-hmm. Craziest event, most intense.
I'm going to cheat. I want to tell you a little bit story that has informed so much of my life that took place at an event. I was a photographer. I am a photographer. I was on tour with U2 in Madrid. We were in the Spanish leg of their tour, and I was in a car with Bono. And he said to me, David, he said, if you're going to speak to people, if you've got an audience of millions for 3 minutes, actually, he didn't say millions. He said, if you've got an audience for 3 minutes, you better say something. And that haunted me ever since, because a lot of my career, I wasn't saying anything. But I've never forgotten it. It was at an event. we were driving to the stadium in Madrid, the Real Madrid's football stadium, I think. So I just wanted to share that, because I think when we talk about activist art and we talk about getting the messages out there, we got to have a message. We got to say something. Why waste our time making pretty things when we can actually speak to people?
Amazing.
And a major name drop. Thank you.
No, it's good. It's good.
Bono always put his political thing out there. I remember even in the 90s when kind of politics, there was like a church and state separation within my rock world, where it was very noticeable when people would bring politics into, basically pop culture, which was rock music at the time. And I've done a lot of thinking about that myself. So we can go into that later. Kari, what about you?
Oh, hello, everyone.
Hello.
Nice
Name, number, and position.
I am Kari Sepp. I am also on the team with James. I'm the editor-in-chief of the 10th magazine, and we are an independent publication that really focuses on the sort of contemporary ideas, aesthetics, and also the history of Black queer communities around the globe. We started in a really micro sense in Brooklyn and expanded then to New Orleans. But the really craziest, I suppose, thing we've ever done was sort of chase a rainbow from the West Coast all the way to Hudson. And that's actually how we wound up landing in Hudson back in 2017. So we sort of travel the country 6 months out of the year making this publication. And typically we've got up to 200 collaborators, all who are people of color, all who are queer, and we're typically engaging a different idea. So we happen to be shooting a story for our technology issue that was all about alien abduction and this sort of like, where does the soul lie? So we were in this weird little island in Portland, late to set, the sun was setting, and lo and behold, James is pulling off the exit to turn us around, and there's a rainbow at the end of the exit. So you've got this like crew of sort of media makers and photographers and, kids who are not really acclimated to the Pacific Northwest, freaking out about what was going to happen as we entered the end of the rainbow. It was crazy because honestly, as our car entered this spectrum of light and mist, we all immediately went silent. Our chakras apparently were activated, we'll come to find out many years later. And it was so transformative. And from that moment on, we had come back to New York and we were in New Orleans as well. We kept seeing these rainbows. So James decides to share a little bit of his art history, which is our resident philosopher and historian at the 10th magazine. He says, did you know about this painting called Landscape with Rainbow? It's by an African-American landscape painter of the 19th century, Robert Duncanson. And I said, well, there's no way that this was painted by a Black painter, because for all I've ever known in like my life as a urban queer, our gallery calls to awful shows all through Chelsea, where Black artists are typically molding our pain and our trauma and our experiences and our identities into works of art to be sold in this problematic gallery system, as you referenced a little bit earlier, David. But the truth of the matter is, they're like, well, this is a beautiful sentiment, this landscape painting. And as he started to kind of unfold the narrative around how sort of Robert Duncanson was in the second generation of the Hudson School artists, was considered to be one of the best and the brightest, was to very little fanfare and acclaim, and was a bit of a ghost when you think about Frederick Church's Alana, when you think about Thomas Cole's house on the other side of the river. And we were like, this figure that's so important and has created this beautiful work and this archive that we followed to the Taft Museum in Cincinnati, where he painted a lot on the Ohio River. We followed it to the Smithsonian. We just became obsessed with this work, but it landed us here in Hudson because we were looking for that rainbow in the flesh. And that's exactly how we wound up here in 2017. And the rainbow followed. I'll never forget, we were staying in Stoughtville at Sarah Van Buren's house, and there was a rainbow in the backyard. And I was like, we're gonna stay in Hudson. And not for nothing, the Basilica, thank you, Melissa, provided the first, and I know it was a simple show, it was Sonia Corinna's show, Tragic Instant. And we had just gotten to town and Shanika McIntosh was doing a poem, and there was this crew of folks, and we were so welcomed into this space when we landed here in Hudson at that show, which was in the gallery at the back of the Basilica, that we never left. We were like, we're coming back, we're moving. Everyone said, sure, everyone says they're moving, they're coming, but we actually showed up about 2 months later and have been for the past 4 years. And it's been a really wild ride ever since. And I say this town has delivered tenfold in terms of community. And wild nights, wild nights, many of them anchored at the Basilica. I'm not just over here patting your back, but it has been such a community hub for everyone and a really welcoming space. And it has fed our souls in terms of community, but also in terms of we like to have fun. So
Yes.
I find that's about
Well, that might be one thing that all the Hudson organizations and people have in common. And obviously, like speaking in the moment of a pandemic and all of our sort of pacified, withdrawn fun, which we are sort of looking at spring, speaking of rainbows. And we just said so many things that have enlightened every chakra in me. So thank you for sharing the rainbow, the alien abduction. So much of that stuff has brought me to all of my places, including Hudson as well. And you've just blown my mind because I can't believe I didn't know about Duncanson. Now I want to make sure we do like an ode to him at the back gallery in some way soon, because I feel almost embarrassed that I don't know that artist, that there would have been. I mean, I obviously don't, I'm not a scholar of it, but that is an example of why I'm so excited to be hosting this conversation with all of you, is that we clearly have different, we've come from different places and we are here in Hudson. We definitely, I would say, all love art, all love fun, and the sort of generous human exchange then, because people don't live in Hudson unless you are an urban dweller. The joke is that it's this tiny, tiny town, but it is so exciting to have a real city that is alive and lit like a city, but it is surrounded by, and I don't mean rural as in the beauty, but the pain and the grit of real America. It's not beautiful rural pastures. It's really politically divided people and things, historically very messed up, class, race, economies, like just a lot of pain. You know, I did not come to Hudson because I thought it was a pretty place to be. That was not, you know, that's the last thing I thought Hudson was, and it's not that. It is it's full of complexities, difficult. I always say that what keeps me here is I believe there's as much potential as there is problem. So there's every problem you've ever, you know, wanted or not wanted to face, and then potentially every solution to take care of that problem. And I do believe that the joy of art, fun, as in we like people, you know, you don't usually like having fun unless you love humanity. I love humanity. I've spent my life touring the world, and if not, living in a tiny town and not leaving for 10 years, the same block, because I like people. I want to know what makes them. And what's exciting to have the three, let's say, newer organizations in Hudson is I want to learn from you a little bit of what you just sort of said of how you came here and why you have activated. But I do feel like, not that we want to focus on the pandemic, but I know that the world has changed inside and out since 2020, you know, not to mention the political wounds. I mean, it's just we have turned we're all changed. Hudson has this incredible opportunity to be even brighter, shining star. And part of it is sort of becoming really connected in these conversations of what brought us here to begin with. How can we at Basilica, you as individuals and organizations, quadruple our efforts to make equity, happy, transparent, non-divisive, fun, and humanity in Hudson, New York? If we can't do it, nobody can. You know, if we can't, and so manageable. The scale is small enough. Our generosity of spirit is here. Art can help guide it. All the kind of historian sorts of something, all the information, it sounds like, James, you have, of like being able to pull out stories from other places and other times and perspectives to get everyone to see. That is why we're here. And I'm just grateful that, Sam, you have created a space for these Hudson people to gather and connect. And I wanted to ask, you know, maybe now, I mean, the Hudson Eye, which is going to be in its third year. So I'm going to start a bit with Jonah. And Jonah was our Basilica, when we arrived in 2010, one of the first other sort of artists who love space. So Jonah's an incredible choreographer. So he is a dancer, a choreographer, but he also was clearly, when we met him, very about space in Hudson. He'd occupied a church up the street on the other side of town. And when we became the Basilica people, he right away just, how can I fill your space? How can I? And he was our first choreographer, dancer in residence at Basilica, based on him workshopping. I'm right? It was when you were workshopping the BAM Black Box show. I mean, you've been there a few times. The point is that we come, the founder and I, Tony and I, film and music, visual arts. Dance is not in our repertoire, and we were so excited to meet this person who was so devoted to bringing movement into our space. So that's how Jonah entered the space. And what brought you to Hudson?
Well, I think Melissa and our hosts and all colleagues on this, everyone is doing such a killer job of bridge making. I'll just call it, or summon that word if we can. But we want to make bridges, right? Not walls. Or I like to say, this place belongs to nature. It doesn't belong to, it belongs to all of us, and it belongs to nature, and it belongs to the indigenous people who may not be here anymore, and all of it. But I think where I harmonize with Melissa in like a really huge way, and your role as a bridge maker is I'll take my cue and say that really the relationships, the relationships that I've been trying to foster and inspire, they date to 2006. And as an artist, I grew up a little bit west of Hudson. I go through the world with like a very, very, Arab, very, very Semitic last name and first name. But it's sort of hard to find that, and then I just loudly relate to Kari and to James, some of what you've been saying is also, there seems to be some bridge making about holding space in Hudson and queer space in Hudson. And so I think that looms large as this version of Hudson starts to get kind of comparisons to like Provincetown and how audiences are changing before our eyes. So it's pretty incredible. But as we all do the work that we do and make these bridges, I come to this word about like relationships, is David, I think I donated a print to your initiative. Ellen has some really wicked news about to drop. Like it's gonna, that I'm not gonna out anybody, but she has this kind of vision for the gallery community. Melissa is right, and I would like to become more of a supporter of Basilica Hudson, and this series is so fierce and so generous. I've tuned in. But Melissa and I have come together in the past to steer, quite frankly, national grants into Hudson. And so I thank her. I thank her for the space that she made to do that. So I'm just kind of reminding myself of our relationships, really, and the fabric between all of us. And James, I think, did like a really killer Hot Topic series, right, in the Hudson Eye, which I guess programmatically we refer to the Hudson Eye. We think it's a she, her, hers, the Hudson Eye. But we refer to her as our toddler, whereas we've all been in town a long time and etc. But we think of her as, as like a baby. And we're all trying to nurture her with the spaces and the artists. But I'm just reminding myself of the relationships on this call and how generous each of we Hudsonites have been, including with each other.
Jonah, I have a quick, super basic question. I'm basic. So can you give a just more literal, like, what is the Hudson Eye? Like experientially, if I went to that, I would experience. Sure. Yeah.
It's a 2-week festival citywide throughout peak tourism season, which from my point of view is Labor Day. So the 2 weeks leading up to Labor Day every year, there is a local artist, local venues fiesta. And at 1 p.m. every day, there's this free humanities series, issue driven. And that's where I really see eye to eye with Melissa, is finding, it's called the Hot Topics, 1 p.m. and free. Tends to be at Hudson Hall, which is we kind of give them the community programming or elaborate on that. Then everybody sees exhibitions all day. And then at 7:30, there is this nightly program that has very low cost tickets. And it tends to be crossover performance and visual programming. So this local artists and local venues initiative, then my job is actually evolving into kind of economic development around this. So we work on it year round. You could think of it as like a mini biennial, but with less money so far. So we work on it year round, and Melissa and I have this kind of shared mission of job creation in town. So that's what it is. It's a 2-week festival, kind of at what I think is the sweet spot for people who are here and people who are kind of day tripping in town, you know? So that's, I don't know if that was a short answer, but that's what we do.
Oh, well, now we're getting to something real, talking about space as it relates to economic development and job creation. Like there's a story in this town that, yes, it relates to sort of historic preservation and sort of artistic vision. But as members of a community that are sort of oftentimes overlooked, I've had to reconcile my identity here more as a Black person than as a gay person, for sure. So when you get those comparisons to this as a summer colony, this as the new Palm Springs or Provincetown, it literally grates on my soul. So I hope in this conversation, we can really talk about how space can be held by different people. You could be on the same block, we'd be having a completely different experience, and also limitations of art institutions in said spaces. So like, I love, Jonah, when you say things like economic empowerment, development, job creation, like that's honestly what I think we should be also trying to come to sort of resolve. And I hope on this call, we can sort of, you know, bat around some ideas, because we are very much connected to the kids in this community.
Yeah.
Really, they're part of our everyday lives. We love Operation Unite. Like, there's so much happening here on the community side as well, that it's tough sometimes when you kind of have to look at Hudson through this international global arts destination, which it is, and we should be celebrating that too. And Jonah, you're doing such a brilliant job with Hudson Eye. It's super inclusive, and those hot topics are actually quite hot. But yeah, I hope that we can talk a little bit about that today.
Cool, and I'd like to relay with you, because I would completely agree. And I think that it's like, if you go to Albany, you know, those monies, they're going to go to universities, they're going to go to National Grid, you know, to make 2,000 jobs. So I am right there with you. I'm right there with you. And I think that there's a conversation about State Street, where our HQ is, and the storefront that's going on. So I'm so glad that you elaborated on that, and in that way, in a big way.
The second question I was going to ask Jonah, but which I now put to both Jonah and Kari, because I think I'm hypothesizing that this somehow ties into what's being discussed, is that I was going to ask to kind of unpack or put in context the meaning of bridge building, which was coming up repeatedly in your discussion, Jonah. And I'm interested in that because, you know, I've been to Hudson many times, but I'm not sure from the outside that I understand why that's of particular import entirely in Hudson, though I could speculate. In New York City, you know, it's like Lincoln build. It's like just bridge. You know what I mean? That's what people are always trying to do. Whether they are or not is a different story, right? But it's like, I'm not sure it has the same meaning where I am as where you guys are. So I wanted to hear more context around why that's a meaningful construction to you. And I thought also, Kari, perhaps what you were getting into there maybe speaks to that a bit.
Sure. I mean, you know, I couldn't agree more. I'm from, you know, the city, you know, Queens and Brooklyn. And, you know, I think one of the beautiful things about being here is that you can remove yourself from a place where those bridges that are existing in the city are typically so transactional, even amongst close friends, you know, sort of networks. They're all super sort of siloed by industry. When you're talking about building bridges in Hudson, you're talking about building community with people that you're going to be breaking bread with. I think the pandemic really highlighted that as well. It was who we were going to choose to spend quality time with, and then who really had built solid bridges. And you come to find out that these were not simply relationships that were built because we were here in a small town with limited folks and social access, but we cared when the pandemic broke and this town was overrun with people coming from the city. The people who've been here and who welcomed us into their social networks and built bridges, and that we continued to pay that forward, we didn't have time. There was a complete, you know, sort of sense of what it means to trust people, to say that I'm in a pod, you know what I mean? I'm being safe, I'm being responsible in my respective workplace, but if we get together and we have like, there's like this different sort of sharing of knowledge as well, even as the vaccine has been being rolled out, you know, information about how that becomes accessible, when Sun Health is offering appointments, there's Harry's Vaccine Finder. So like those things are sort of more matters of life and death, as opposed to career-minded, industry-based. To be honest with you, everyone here who's become a transplant, of course we are, you know, we fit into that category, they're already established in their careers. You know, they're not looking for the next come up on a gallery crawl, or they're not looking for a networking experience. We're here to have peace, quiet, build bridges, and share with people that we really care about. And some of the friends, I know James and I can kind of both speak on that. We spend a lot of time together. This is our family. It is what it is. And we do, you know, oftentimes invite folks up, you know, with this, when the pandemic had broken, a bridge to Melissa. We were, you know, interested, you know, my partner Kyle is on Broadway. They wanted to do a benefit for kids living with type 1 diabetes when she was diagnosed with a few years back. And the Broadway community was all out of work. And in the city, there were no venues that were willing to open their doors to let the performers come in to share their talents. And this is something that those types of performers and artists do because they have to. Jonah, you know, you're a dancer, I must dance, I must work the body, I must be present, I must occupy space in a very different way. And Melissa, Tony was so great. They opened the doors of the Basilica and allowed us to come in and host all of these performers safely. Of course, we've got the space in the Basilica to do so, but that show inspired a lot of people. But it was, again, it was a community effort. It was Kitty showing up with the chicken and rice and the chopped salad. It was the coffee runs. It was the fact that we had our Colton was on the second camera, like all local talent, because we all trusted one another. So I don't know, I just think it speaks very different to how we work collaboratively here, as opposed to in the city where it's like, yeah, how can this turn into a spark of something that is probably unrealistic? And I'm rambling now. James.
It actually ties a bit to James in your high school. It's like that scale of high school and change, and you can actually change the place you live in, which is what has kept me here entirely. And I'm going to keep letting everyone else speak because I'm learning a lot and I'm grateful.
I think what you're saying, and also continuing the thought of what Kyrie was speaking about and giving sort of kudos to Jonah as well, is the thing I really took to in this town is that, you know, although people are friendly, they're willing to have these tough conversations. Mm-hmm. And, you know, the places like the Spotty Dogs or like at Back Bar or I should say the Half Moon, you know, where you really have to sit there and someone can have a totally different political ideology or, you know, some sort of totally different upbringing from you, but people here are really interested in having tough conversations. I've never been in a place where you're like Kyrie and I will be sitting with friends and we think that we're saying something super provocative, and then someone nudges in and they're like, actually, this is what I think, and we're like, we completely disagree with you.
The first night we got here, we were in a war. Stephen B. Anthony's first. It was happening, and there was this conversation around abolition and sort of suffrage movement, and we were literally at the table screaming to the point of over tables at Red Dot, which of course everyone, well, for those of you who don't know, was one of the earlier kind of restaurants that existed on Maur. And I'll never forget, the owners when we were leaving came over and tapped us and said, "Thanks for tonight. You're gonna fit in.
Like, please come back. You know, this is what Hudson used to be like." And it's also about knowing when to, I don't want to say get out the way because that sounds a bit combative, but at least like we're talking about making space. So Jonah, you know, was working with Elena from Operation Unite, who also looped me in and said, "Hey, could you please curate this panel? We're going to be talking about the Black Arts Festival." And so what does that mean? What does it mean to, you know, it's one thing to provide you know, one thing that I really get hot about is you see like these African American studies programs at these different, you know, Ivy League institutions, and most of them are any other higher level institutions, not to you know, to sort of be horrible about that, but you look at them and you don't see the professors, the people who are in charge of the departments, the people that are telling the story are not the people that look like us and are not the ones that are most impacted by the story. So, you know, Jonah coming in and saying, hey, you know what, we want to know about African-American presence in the Hudson River Valley. And I can say, okay, great. I can tell you the story about Duncanson. I can tell you the story about what is going on in Great Barrington and bring in the folks from James Weldon Johnson Foundation who are preserving, you know, that archive and that land. And there's a certain pride and there's certain nuances that people who are part of the culture can capture that no one else can. But we can only do that when we know when to say, like Melissa said, I'm going to give you the space. I'm going to let other people talk. And that's what I like about Hudson. There's this, there's a great balance of that. I think obviously there's a lot of work to do, but there is a balance of people saying, okay, let me let you talk about it because this is what you live. It's not just in the history books for you, but this is like your grandparents, your grandmother was hanging out with James Baldwin at the bar, and she knows how he was not the nicest person all the time and what he was really giving outside of how you all want to canonize him. Like, these are the people who actually live with the story. And so that's just a great part. And I love that we have
I wanted to I just wanted to, and Jonah, I know you wanted to say something. So I just wanted to, I love what you're saying, James. And I think this idea of Hudson being a place where you can have conversations with everybody. And Melissa, something that you said, you know, it's a place that you actually can impact. It's you can change things. You an individual of any background has power in Hudson because there's so many people willing to listen and collaborate. That's what I have found in the last couple of years. But, you know, when you talk about, like Sam asking about building bridges, one of the things that's bothered me.
Just quickly,
yeah.
What I said was, I'm for bridges, not walls. And,
no.
And that we're all bridge makers.
We have to be bridge makers. But one of the things that has bothered me about having an art gallery on Warren Street is this inherent elitism to what that means. And this definition of Hudson being creative and artistic and collaborative and everyone working together. Yes, there is that world, there is, but the local community doesn't come to Warren Street. They don't go to, I don't know if they go to Basilica, I don't know if they go to Hudson Eye. I mean, they didn't really come to Jewel the Wound, and we had, you know, it was all local artists and it was activist art. And David and I did so much community building, really trying to create an invitation, you know, to say, this is for you. And we're still working really hard at that. And so I find that building bridges in some ways is easy and accessible and successful. And in other ways, I feel like, at least I need your help here on this panel. I'm hitting a wall trying to get I started a scholarship at the high school, and I started a monthly art salon. Well, of course it was right before the pandemic, but to get the art students at Hudson High School to come to art galleries on Warren Street, because that's their backyard. They should know what's happening in the art world. If they're studying art and if they're interested in art, they should be coming, and they don't come. And I've invited them and tried and worked with Elena and worked with David, and it's not easy, and I don't know how to do it. And I think we all have to be trying to come up with these ideas for this particular bridge. I mean, this is my thing, is this bridge, and I need help, and I don't know how to do it.
We have to do it together, but
yeah.
I want to say something about that with the history of the municipality and the government here to give context. But Jonah, were you about to say something?
I was gonna say, like, take that cue and say, on this panel, what can the seven of us come together?
Mhm.
What can we do on this panel? And I would agree, and I would add the very, very large Bengali community that is here and that is a voting bloc and is Arabic speaking and building a mosque, and like it cuts in so many ways, and it's so beautiful. So how can we all on this? Melissa, you did it. Like you did it. You got us all, and
Oh, and we have so many, like, I think Hudson is in the best shape it's ever been, between Shanika, now with Spark, the library does such an amazing job. There's Kite's Nest, there's so Operation Unite, clearly Hudson Hall, there isn't, but from my decade plus perspective, we did not have a born and raised in Hudson African-American mayor until a year ago. So I have seen nothing but psychic pain since the day I arrived here until that person became empowered the moment that election happened. And that was 3 months before a pandemic. So imagine Mayor Kamal's world. He becomes the first born and raised in Hudson mayor, and very much with youth and bridge building. And very, very wonderful, non-divisive, so proud to have voted for him because I knew it would do a psychic shift for the community, because prior to him, we are living, for those, I've talked about this in all the podcasts, and Sam has heard an earful of this, but we are in a Republican district, and we are a now only blue little blob in the past, when I arrived, we were in a full red district in a blue state. So we don't want to go into gigantic national politics or red versus blue politics, but the level of division and pain and neglect and an industry of poverty, which a local municipality and county continued to perpetrate for decades upon decades, not to mention the national disaster when all of the manufacturing was shipped out of the US and all the local jobs. There's been nothing but decline since the 1950s in the area. And there's been nothing but displaced homes and subsidized housing, creating divided communities. I mean, Hudson's backbone is so bruised and broken. And I have not seen any hope in this being rectified until Mayor Kamal was elected. So we are only 1 year in. The level of mistrust that has been in every person, and I'm very happy to hear all of you talk about the sort of feeling of you can talk about anything. I did not feel like that when I arrived here. And Jonah, I think that you and I speak on a more, and I mean this in a loving way, esoteric, dreamscape. So you and I have always spoken, but I have certainly not been able to bring my esoteric dreamscape to anybody in Hudson. No way. Hudson has grounded me in pain, division, and walls, a lot of, because there's so little trust. So my goal with, I didn't give all of you the context, but we all can be friends forever from here on out. But our next 10 years is entirely devoted on doing everything that I was not able to do or see, or I didn't see the blind spots. There was no willing people when we started in 2010. There was so much hate and division and so much mistrust, and therefore one side of town, the other side of town, that was so far from bridge. There was like Republican people who barely even lived in Hudson who actually hated all people of color, all people of different, gender or sexual orientation. I mean, we were living in a pretty bigoted place. So, this is new to even be able to speak and hope that we can now. We will bridge those, but we're so far, Ellen, there's so much work we all have to do, and Basilica is willing to redouble, quadruple efforts. Everyone here on this call is, and I think that is when the bridges with the youth generations and all the different populations, because the Bangladeshi community as well as the Bliss Towers community, they're not all integrated either. There's a lot of segregation within a very small 2 square miles.
And I think, sorry.
Into the conversation, but maybe, not maybe, because everyone doesn't want to integrate.
Yeah, everyone doesn't want to integrate.
Excellent, thank you.
It doesn't, and I have to agree with Kyrie, and I'm sorry to jump in, but I always use this story my parents were, grew up in the low country of South Carolina, and they grew up during integration and the Black Power movement. And these are products of people who lived in neighborhoods where their principals, the funeral homes, the physicians were all Black. And so when integration happened, that desegregation actually was the demise of the Black capitalism and the systems that they were lived in. So when my mother and father, who were the top 10 of their class, if it wasn't for their Black church telling them to go to college and our relatives, the white counselors don't talk to them. And so I think integration, and it has its great, there's a lot of benefits to it, but there's also, people don't really understand, like, they're not necessarily safe spaces is what I'm getting at, because everyone doesn't understand the nuances about culture. They don't understand the cultural significance that gender plays in certain societies. Not everyone is a man led by the men. Some societies adore and worship their women. We don't have that type of context. And I think one thing that we have to do is really educate people first before we start going into these spaces. And Ellen, I think that's helpful because, you're talking about these kids and doing all the work and building these relationships. Especially I can speak to Black children, they need to see that being in the art world they're not some outsider and they're not an exception to the space, but we've been in that space. We've created that space. That's in our ancient DNA. And so unless you can really link that, I think people are even trying to figure out, like, why am I even here? I feel more comfortable on Fairview than I do on Warren. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that is okay.
I think that, so I don't want to interrupt, but just a quick thing. The thread that I see began at people don't go to Warren Street and then got to this integration idea. Yeah. And something that you see a lot in progressive discourses is propagating integration as a means of addressing what are fundamentally material issues.
Yeah.
Right. And then you're bringing up the very real and legitimate point that not everybody wants to integrate. That doesn't necessarily solve a material issue anyway.
Right.
And then all of this seems to me to be relevant to the different takes that are coming up on the difficult conversations. Because I thought it was interesting that there was one take that was, there is this appetite for these difficult conversations. And then Melissa's experience, which contradicted that. I'm interested in looking at that a little bit more to whatever extent people with. And then I also want to introduce a third take because I've also been appreciating the low-key critiques of city life vis-a-vis Hudson life, because I agree completely. Everything's transactional.
Notches over there, Sam. The high-key critique.
I was being, I didn't want to implicate someone. Anyways, high key critique, like everything being transactional. And I would also extend that critique to the appetite for the conversations, because in the city, and you guys can tell me if you have a different experience, I feel that it's gotten to the point where New York, a place historically known for being able to have a difficult conversation if you needed to, right, has gotten to a place where people want to have like hot takes and only hot takes, but not dialogue. And people actually want to stay out of that lane because they don't want to end up on the wrong side of something or be put on blast in a certain way. They want to come with the pithiest, hottest take and moonwalk out of there. So even if the conversation is a bad conversation, or if people do have that appetite for the difficult conversation, either way, if a conversation is happening, that's a positive, because I really see a foreclosure on dialogue in urban life in America as exhibited by New York. Just throwing all that out there.
I just wanted to pitch in this idea that people might not all want to integrate. It's very valid, but I think everybody wants to be heard, and everybody perhaps want their stories to be recorded and told. And we as creatives and inherently as storytellers, that is a really simple place that we can operate. When Ife Cobbins read her poem at the Hudson Milliner Art Salon, she brought her community with her. So that was a way that we brought people into this tower straight onto Warren Street. And if we had a festival of portraits of artists and dancers and writers, all like collaborating with locals, telling their story on Warren Street, we would fill Warren Street with locals and Basilica. We'd be all the way there of you.
That's an excellent.
I'm trying to link because you're off Warren Street.
No, that's an excellent point, David. People do want to be heard, and people want their stories heard, and that is the bridge to being able to have these sort of diverse spaces, because you understand where they're coming from.
Yeah, but, there's always another level to that. Who is telling the story? Who is?
I understand.
Of course.
Distribution. I mean, of course we're having different conversations. Melissa represents a different class of person. She's a head of an institution. She's a big property owner. Most of the people of color here, we're renting. Like, it's a whole class, socioeconomic sort of. It's messy, right? And what's interesting about James and I is that, we're doing a lot of bait and switching in this neighborhood. Like, we can, what African Americans or Black folks say, code switch, you know what I mean? And be having a different conversation with you all on this podcast than we're having with our homies in the hood, but we're having with Kamal and Quentin Harris and Quentin Cross, I'm sorry. So like, it's like interesting. We need to create spaces that people are allowed to be truly safe. And those places are not always integrated spaces, but then we need to empower people to show up in communal spaces and have a space in those spaces. Like, there's orders of magnitude to this thing.
But it's where you're really talking about access, though. That's kind of what I was getting at. It's hard to, when you're in this elitist world, it's hard to make it clear that, or figure out a way to give everyone access to that world if they want it.
Yeah, and for youth to be invited for free if they want it. You can't make anyone believe they want, but that's a nice.
Yeah.
Because these kids, they don't know that they want or need access, or that they need networks of social capital. They need to worry about how they're going to keep their cell phones on.
Exactly.
Their sort of basic needs are not always being.
It's so funny that you say that, Kari. One of the things that just showed my ignorance when I was doing this salon, and I just think so many of the kids were like, "Oh, I wish I could go. I have to work. I'm taking care of my siblings. My mom's working overnight tonight, so I need to be home. I don't have a car. I can't get to Warren Street." Like, and it's just this kind of like, oh shit, I got to go about this in a different way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing, got it. I hear what you're saying, Ellen, and Kari. I call it switching codes. That's what I do, and I very often I have to more than I would have thought in Hudson. I have to switch languages, and so by speaking Arabic, but I don't speak Urdu and I don't speak Bengal, right? So I have. So the switching codes, and in the gay community versus like if my family's visiting from a little bit west of here, I don't know. So I find it kind of endlessly, it's full of subtlety, it's full of meaning. And so I wonder if, like, in a really collegial way, or open, if we can open a space together, like, are there some, how in France, like, they give the French government, the budget for culture is 2% of the nation, and here it's like 1/2 millionth of a dollar. So there's this term that I actually kind of love, which is cultural actions. So could we all, could we brainstorm about a cultural action that we would want to see or do for Hudson? Like, one thing I really want to do is I would like for the Hudson Eye next year, like Aaron, I think he should be represented, and Aaron had, really, it took many years, but then the David Hammond's flag and doing a lot of work outdoors and free. So I think he will probably double free public outdoor art, which will also be safe, because I still have a lot of questions about vaccine access and how that's going to roll out. In terms of the government, like in the 106th district here, we're sort of in another region, so it's a really tough area, because it's not what's called the capital region. It's not Albany, but it's not mid-Hudson. So we've got a tough one, and we all have to come together and be very real and very mindful. So I would like to, support Aaron. He has this idea to double things and to make them free and outdoors. And then I would like to make a move, a cultural action. I would like Vishaka Desai to come out or to arrive and to speak, outdoors by the waterfront and just see who would come. Mrs. Asia Society, Mrs. Subcontinent, and just sort of see where that would pull the gravity. So that's an action, or like a Melissa, as you say, is like a dream of mine.
Jonah, can you put that in context for people who don't know anything about Hudson? Like what?
Sure.
Like you're kind of describing an event that I can tell would mean something specific to you, but being on outside of Hudson, nobody knows what that means.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, Sam, I guess, but what I mean by cultural actions is a colleague of mine, Aaron, who tries to support local artists. He would like to double the number of free outdoor kind of public art types of actions. That's something he wants to do. I would like to bring a speaker that really holds down the South Asian community and have her speak outdoors and free. That's like something I want to do. Action I want to try and figure out,
And what is it about those things that you're specifically curious about because of the texture of the social fabric in Hudson? Like why are those people a relevant example of something you'd like to do?
Darling, I have hundreds of more. I'm just trying to steer us towards. I want us to brainstorm is like what do we want our actions to be? So I don't know. I don't know. I'm just
no.
dreaming.
Gotcha. Well, I hearing all of you talk. This is super it's really honestly fascinating to see 6 people who are clearly very steeped in a place go in, and I'm like trying to put this and there, you know what I mean, because I'm not as familiar with Hudson, but this is how I relate to my neighborhood and my precinct and my borough and so on and so forth. So to see it kind of like from the outside is a really amazing opportunity for me. Something that I'm interested to hear what you guys would have to say about, and that I also ask myself as a person who helms a space which is a resource. The discussion about access. I mean, I'm very interested in all discussions about social justice that involve materiality, like materially shifting the circumstance so that somewhere where there was a dearth of a resource, there is now no longer a dearth of that resource, right? There's an objective feedback loop. It's not some kind of cultural trickle-down economics, like if every high school student in New York goes and sits in front of Jackson Pollock, they're going to be more creative. Like this kind of thing, I don't actually believe in at all. But I do believe in like material shifting of resource to places where there are not resources, right? And I think a really good question when we talk about access is to this sounds super obvious, but it is a good question. I think access to what, right? Like especially in the fine arts world, a lot of what you would think of as having access to is the flower at the end of the stem of the plant, right? To walk into a gallery, to have access, you don't really have access because the art world is a machine, right? Access begins deeper in that machine. Do you understand what I'm saying? So I think the question about access is access to things that become generative spaces for people. But I'm just putting the question out there, access to what? You know what I mean? I could riff all day, but you know what I mean?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the traditional way of getting a painting on a gallery wall, right? Like that's a very, I hate to use the word elitist again, but there's a path, right? That lots of people don't have access to that path. Mm-hmm. But the fine art world is changing. Mm-hmm. And there are lots of different models if you are an artist, to create art and to feel confident that you are in a place where you can make art, that you have permission to make art. So when I say access, I mean permission to see yourself as an artist, to meet people that will talk to you, mentor you, introduce you to curators, gallerists, have access to conversations. That's what I mean by access. I don't mean access to riches and fame. I just mean access to permission to see yourself in a certain way. And
it's real, yeah.
Which is, sorry, one other thing with this public art thing, we should talk about the public art, Jonah, with Aaron and with everybody on this panel, because I know David and I are working on a public art, activist public art show for this summer that we should probably connect with everybody about it. So anyway, that's it.
And Basilica is always a space.
Melissa, it's coming from you in our Hudson Valley activist chronogram conversation, which you had a lot of thoughts on. And so you're already involved.
Yes. But I actually wanted to this access thing because of this is when my when the conversations get this, I always step back into my unfortunate default position of a socialist Canadian and access to education, jobs, and health. So we can't go into that, but I want to remind you as a fellow Hudson resident and business owner / founder of an institution person is that my wake up call to the USA after basically just living in the ether, traveling the world, but coming from a culture in Montreal, Canada, that was very equal access to all of those things I just said, is that my broken spirit that is coming back, and I believe the pandemic is healing a lot of things, is that my naivete arriving in Hudson was not understanding how limited that access. I, of course, knew since the day I arrived in the US that it is a criminal how individual, no one, whether, the access to those three fundamental things is not readily available to all basic people. And that is just fundamentally wrong. It creates mental health, physical health problems. It creates, financial disaster. So that is, I know that's very broad and absurd, but I'm just saying that as your co-host and neighbor, is that I am always deeply humbled and saddened by that access problem, that I did not really grow up around knowing just how bad that could be until I moved to a small town USA. And it doesn't mean that I didn't know there was poverty and no socialized medicine and no affordable school. I mean, I knew that, but I didn't feel it on a psychic level until I lived here for a decade plus, right? So I do want to make sure that, this is a seed for conversation of obviously art access and free art, all of these things. But it's also that question of the municipal change and how originally when Jonah and Kari, you spoke about, the job creation, is that we are Basilica humbly and for the first time really stepping back from arts, A, because it's a pandemic and we can barely do it, but B, because I feel like this is our cue to be we want Basilica to be of service to those three things in the post-pandemic, post-Trump pain. And how can a space and an organization that has a 501c3 status be leveraged? And that's sort of what I innocently for the last 5 years have been saying to anyone who would listen, is most business owners that come to Hudson, whether it's a nonprofit are very, they didn't come to a clean, fixed place. They were aware that there were problems. And I was always saying, well, we should all be leveraged. Everyone should be held accountable to hire or train local or, something. And that's just been sort of words for years of just all of us. And I would often default to the municipal people that should be asking these local, but they don't have enough, they're literally busy trying to keep lights on and sidewalks and taxpayers, in line. So we have to move the change and create access to the things that society is not providing. Not that we're going to start healthcare, but we're going to start education, communication streams. We're going to empower at least our neighbor to know a little bit more of what's available on, like, you know, in all of these quite remarkable nonprofits that are growing stronger. And as the wealth from the city moves up, this is the moment we have to be really making sure that we are all being leveraged to help the locals of Hudson who are not at all benefiting from any of this evolution, and that these very basic, simple needs of access to education, health. I didn't know, but New York State does have decent social services if you really go through all the millions of hoops, et cetera. And youth and job creation for young adults, those and pathways to jobs. So that's for me to just bring it all back to, how my socialist as a co-founder of Basilica wants to help right now is figure out how to help that direct thing. And it starts, we're not a youth organization, but we certainly can be leveraged to host youth and to be a place of gathering and informing families of opportunities. But I guess that's, when we're getting away from the place of assembly and arts, but in many ways it's not, because you don't really, I've been saying, and people are laughing at me, but like arts is nothing unless you have health and education. I know it has a power to heal. Believe me, I've been around the world and I see it in people's souls, and I know it is a healing, but the luxury of art is real, as we know. And if you have no food, health, family, what on earth is art going to give you? Nothing. Maybe you might meet someone or blow your mind. What is the point? So I have been struggling myself as a founder of an art center that, especially in the last year, and then my psychic pain that grew in the last 5 years, I'm like, this is ridiculous. Like, what am I doing? How do we do? So that's all, I'm just saying that for our neighborhood scene right now, is that Basilica is here to be leveraged and used. I want to help any efforts that you have. And we are spearheading our own workforce development and mainly just stepping back to offer the space, because this is, we have to hold those that don't have any of this. And that's, and that's why I mentioned Mayor Kamal, is I believe that our current mayor is really willing to collaborate with all of us to do these things. And what do we do? And I feel like I almost, because we went kind of deep into the access there, but I almost want to segue back into the spaces people hold, and the 10th magazine in particular. Is that my notes here was like, I'm assuming you started in print based on long form journalism information. And then of course you have this website. So you have, of course, non-print format. And then I see that you do events. And then I also saw the exciting, and I wanted James to speak to it too, the 10th Academy. So, so that's an example of like a publication,
right,
that started in this way, but then as it becomes more local and localized, and it's also in this virtual, so it has access to global stories that is specific to your community. That is a really exciting opportunity in terms of you holding space, and what you were talking about earlier, being in a flip-flop between race, gender orientation, local, global. You're in a 10th magazine is in a very unique position in Hudson right now to serve on all these layers. And I was hoping to hear a bit more, because that was what I was excited about this conversation, is seeing how our different formats, art galleries, art shows, spaces, can wrap this up, and I feel like you have, the 10th magazine has this like incredibly diverse layer of connection, not to mention and then also the radio show that you've started. So talk to us a little bit about, now that we kind of have it all out there, of how you're moving through Hudson in 2021.
Oh, sure. And thank you for those lovely words. And it feels really special to be, in a space and be able to, sort of traditionally in ancient and indigenous cultures, queer people were typically seen as gatekeepers, or, what we would consider trans identities in contemporary culture might have been seen as two-spirited folks. These are cultures where multiple gender identities and sort of sexual orientations were sort of seen as part of, I suppose, the sort of social ecosystem. So it's interesting to even have to hold space in your own community. I think another part of the 10th's mission is to be able to unravel the internalized homophobia in the Black community, to be able to say, here we are with access to resources. Part of the sort of origins of the 10th are, well, it's threefold. One of them happens to be an essay by W.B. Du Bois called The Talented 10th, which really essentially speaks to this notion of those with the most resources being able to share said resources for the benefit of the entire community. So we look at ourselves as queer people, oftentimes tasked with, a lot of us don't necessarily have traditional family structures or children. The cisgender men, I should say. A lot of our sort of gay sisters are obviously out here raising families, and that's very, very important in the culture. But like, we see ourselves as having access to resources and time, and we have also a bit of a visibility that attracts a lot of young minds. So, what does it mean to then be operating in a space of queer independent media, but having resources that are quite valuable to all children of color? And actually, what does specifically Black queer history have to teach all people, right? What is its relevancy to the global conversation around human suffering, about social justice, and not just what's happening here in our little community, but how does that connect around the globe? And I think that's what Jonah was speaking about as well. It's like, well, how do we sort of use our struggle and our experience to build or be bridges to other communities who might be experiencing those things as well? And then how can we coalition build? And I'm glad that James came back on, because he can talk a little bit about that. But ultimately what we're doing now, and we did grow out of a very traditional print publication, only because we are playing with this idea of what it means to be in control and to be an owner. See, I think access is probably not what we're looking for. What we're looking for is autonomy, right? So we don't want to have to depend on the government for our money. We don't want a job, actually. Guess what? We want capital gains taxes. We want cryptocurrency. We don't want to go to work. We don't want to have to rely on the government for our healthcare as well. We want to be able to buy healthy food and not live in a food desert, so that we're not riddled with sickness and these types of things. So like, I agree with what Sam was saying about this notion of access. We look at it as more sort of autonomy. So the work in print for us was us quite simply saying, I know that everyone has said print is dead. Digital media, the venture capital was flooding into the market when we kind of came into this space. We had taken tons of VC meetings. They didn't understand, what does it mean? What does this community you speak of that is queer and of color, and why would we want to fund these things? So we were just sort of saying, we want our book to be archived at research institutions like the Schoenberg Research Center in Harlem and the Amistad Research Archives in New Orleans. We want it to be on the bookshelves at places like Barnes and Nobles, which it is. We want it to be at museum and gallery shops. We also want it to be in the bodegas in Brooklyn, which it is, and be really this kind of like document of existence. And I think how it sort of connects to like our sort of expanded purpose at the Academy, and James, I would love you to hop back on here, is that we feel so responsible to empower our kids to claim their autonomy. We can create access pipelines for them. We know people, we're connected. We're on this phone with 6 very connected and important people by everyday standards. We can create sort of connections, but we want kids to be able to say, I'm going to enter this relationship with someone who's supposedly, granting me access, knowing that I've got value. Knowing that I'm not just some commodity for a grant, knowing that I have some value in this person's institution, not just as a number to check off that you attended, but are you there contributing to the culture of the organization? See, these are things that we're trying to teach our kids, and then to also understand that we don't need to trade in sort of oppression narratives, and we need to do trauma work. Absolutely, Melissa, that is so true. That trauma healing, it's gotta start there. We're so damaged as it relates to sort of not having autonomy over our bodies and our wallets and these things, but then also there's like intergenerational pain. So I believe we must operate there. And then we must operate in terms of empowering folks, because Ellen, it's true. If you walk up Warren Street and you feel empowered, like you're supposed to be there because your family has been in this town for the last 3 generations. Yeah. And, it's creating that sort of, that narrative. And James can speak to that, having gone to a historically Black college and university. And that's probably also tied into kind of education as well. What we're here to do, James, and how this has expanded our role in Hudson, I think was the question.
Oh, okay. Well, I disagree with, I mean, I agree with everything Kyrie said. I don't think I can, I think it's beautifully said. And, the only thing I guess I would add to that, not really hearing what was said earlier, but just I can't emphasize enough is that what really tore me apart, luckily I did, as Kyrie mentioned, I went to a historically Black college, one that my family has had a history there for several generations at a few of the institutions that I went to. So, and then that was not just something that it was rare, that was something that all of my classmates sort of had in common, my roommates, people that I worked alongside with in college. But I just want to say that growing up, also Kyrie and I, and Kyle, who's not on this call, and Andre, who are co-founders, we all have that common thread that we grew up in very strong Black neighborhoods. And we grew up seeing people who, again, talking about exceptionalism, it wasn't exceptionalism, it was a standard. And we also understand that pain is a part of our culture, it's a part of being African American. So yes, self-care and trauma work is important, I'm not downing that. But when you look at our grandparents and our parents, that's just a part of the fabric of life. And you take that pain, you absorb it, and you make it into something beautiful, and you keep going forward because someone paid it for you to be able to stand where you are. Because there's just not enough time to not, it's a very collective culture. I also want to say that what really burned me when I was younger, even though I had that strong environment, it was not confirmed, or that education, that knowledge of saying that I'm not an exception, I'm the standard, was not something that was continued in my school system curriculum. My parents had to constantly combat a miseducation that I learned for 8 hours of a day. They had to be the ones to present to me Black poets and writers and all of the history that I had. That wasn't something that my teachers were doing. And so one thing that I don't like is that which really drives me is that there's a lot of young Black kids who don't see themselves in a bucolic pastoral environment, or they don't see themselves as landscape painters, or they'll be the first one to say that the only music that I identify with is hip hop, which is a great art form, but they don't know about Kathleen Battle and Jesse Norman, and they don't know about Leontine Price, or they don't know that the principal dancer at the Martha Graham Company is a Black queer man, and also at American Ballet Theater, and they don't understand how that also goes back to the ancient tradition of Egypt, which is really called Kemet. They don't know that this stuff is within our DNA. We don't know how the oldest form of Christianity is not necessarily in these European countries, it's in Ethiopia. We don't know that. And it's the more that we don't bring to these stories of obscurity up to a level where these kids can see themselves and say, you know what, landscape art and Hudson River Valley and art and historic preservation is not a white thing. That is something that is inherently a part of my DNA. Farm to table and organic farming, that's not something new to Black folks. We've been agriculturalists these are ancient traditions of why we were captured as slaves to come over here, was to teach the colonists how to farm. So when I see they're like, oh, well, Black folks being in farming is so radical. No, it's not. That's who we are. My great grandfather, how he built some sort of, something to pass on to my parents was to have a farm. He farmed, over 10 acres of land. And that's not a story that is rare. That happened in these rural Southern communities up here in the Valley. We need to share more of those stories. We have to, because they do something to you when you realize that you actually existed, and you existed everywhere.
And that's what the 10th Academy essentially will be doing, is offering access to these types of courses that will range from an archaeological dig at the James Weldon Johnson Foundation in the Berkshires, where they're literally restoring James Weldon Johnson, who's an 20th century African-American composer who wrote the lyrics for Lift Every Voice, which is the Black national anthem. He's got a really beautiful writing cottage. The Berkshires happens to be where the NAACP, a lot of the leadership and sort of key members took root in that area. It also happens to be the birthplace of W.B. Du Bois. we're doing things to just kind of create community safe spaces for queer kids in particular to just learn and to also share. And that's going to have to be done somewhat in a bubble. But then wouldn't it be great for those kids to then feel empowered, Ellen and David and Melissa, and to come to your spaces feeling more empowered, able to engage you less as a charity case and more as a let me teach you about what you don't know about, and feel empowered to do that. And then we kind of become more equitable, right? And then we talk about redistribution and things that the Canadians get super right, although they've got their challenges up there as well. Of course, the Indigenous folks are in an uproar, but I just, would love for us to be able to, through the Academy, to really help our kids. There's a young man here in town who's doing a great project. It deals with solar energy on rooftops to provide internet access.
Yeah.
And it's amazing what this guy's been able to create at 21 years old.
Yeah.
We're like, well, how can we throw some fire on it and connect you to who we know? It's quite simple, but, we want to create citizens that are more, we can't expect everybody, we have to heal. We have to heal. We're not to heal ourselves in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and Kyrie makes a really good point because, and I'm not saying that because we work together, but I just, it is about these bridges that we're talking about. Melissa, I know you have were you in a band? I think that's an understatement, but you have but how cool is it to have, kids come to you and show up in a space and say, you know what, I know that Black folks had something to do with founding punk rock in this country in the 1960s because of a band called Death. And that's a different way of showing up in a space. That's the way we're able to go in these spaces and not, we had one young photographer who came and met us in Cape Cod, and he was like, oh, I'm so traumatized. This is such a white space. And I'm like, you need to show up like you own this space, because there's an island called Martha's Vineyard that Black folks have been owning property and going to there's a whole history of Black folks in the Cape. You cannot show up afraid. You have to show up, and that's a way of connecting. If you learn that, we can connect with others that don't look like us, but at least, I'm rambling, but you all get what I'm saying.
Yeah. No, this is good. This is good. I'm feeling it.
Yeah.
It's a lesson for all young folks, and certainly coming out of Scotland in a rural community heading to London, you learn, you just got to walk in like you own the joint at 18, 19, and that's everywhere.
David, you're from Scotland, and I know that's a whole nother dynamic. I mean, it's so interesting. Is that where you kind of got how you got here?
I'm a farm kid, Scotland, the greenest person ever to show up in London. At least it felt that way at 18. But
hearing all of this go by, and it's a lot and it's amazing, I'm reminded of a quote that I'm just going to throw out there. And I'm not saying it is or isn't of any particular relevance, but it comes up for me. There's a Fred Moten quote, who's one of my personal faves. Yes. Shout outs. It would be a personal victory of extreme magnitude if he did the pod and talked about habits of assembly as a whole bit on habits of assembly, but I don't think I'm ready for that, so I'm holding off on that invitation. Anyways, there's a Fred Moten quote where he says, I'm paraphrasing, so forgive me if I don't get this exactly right. He says, the coalition emerges from you realizing that this shit is fucked up for you too, as much as it is, or although not as much as it is for me, something along those lines. And then he says, to realize that this shit is killing you too, however much more softly, you stupid motherfucker,
Dirty talk.
but the point is that it's not, this was coming up for me when you were talking about autonomy and talking about showing up like you own the place. And it's not about asking for something, but what Fred is saying there is, but you should realize that this shit is fucked up for you too. And that's where it's possible for there to be a coalition. Now, I'm not agreeing or disagreeing. I'm just saying that came up for me hearing all of this, and I was moved
All
to
the big existential questions and issues that are facing our planet today, like climate change, those have nothing to do with boundaries and made up races. Like the stage that we're in right now, right, the loop is being closed. You know, everyone's going to suffer famine, sea level rising. Like it's like almost past the point of having to be so clever to explain it. You can see it on the news. You can see the wildfires burning. You can see the floods and everyone's being affected by this, right? And it's typically at this point now, Americans who've been robbed of all wealth and all opportunity who are suffering. But it's like, well, how far will this have to go we're off the cliff, but how far will we have to fall before people really get it? You know, it really calls into question, you know, kind of the sort of level of civilization that we're at. You know, like at what point in the middle/dark ages do we really find ourselves? Because it's crazy that we can't see that it's fucked up for everybody, that us and our sort of tech obsessions and our waste and our digging up every last fossil fuel the planet can find and exploding mountaintops, like that's not clear to you all, that that's not going to work. So I don't know. I think, you know, for our kids too, like that's an opportunity, you know, to show up and to be instrumental in teaching those lessons. Indigenous cultures have lived at relative peace with the earth for thousands of years. And then in 100 years of industrialization by the West, we see our planet literally on its last leg. So I don't know, I think there's a lot here that we can kind of also connect to as sort of, you know, just humanists in a way.
Exactly. The humanists and just the acknowledgement of the corporate, and not even corporate is a modern word, but the greed of be it kings and queens or corporations, the greed that has created the division, the pain, and those who do not have. I mean, that capitalism is, you know, cool modern way to talk about it, but all of these things, the pandemic, which is why I believe that on a psychic level, the 2020 shift, it's the opening, and the climate catastrophe was there before the pandemic, and Basilica, you know, for another conversation, it's pretty much the priority for our next 10 years is to activate information and infrastructure change in Hudson, at the very least, to be able to change some of the fossil fuel carbon footprints, and through that, all the opportunities with green jobs, et cetera. That's a big part of our next 10 years. And that's what I have spent the majority of the pandemic doing, is preparing the shift of what we will do, which is why I've been really excited to talk to arts organizations that are more focused on art, because I actually have stepped away in a way, but I am from it. But this humanist and this moment of enlightenment that is potentially around the corner, is kind of like the universal crossroads, both between the pandemic and the climate catastrophe, that then I believe will spark the new Hudson. Because in there is the clear pain, the clear problem. And then, hey, why don't we just do what we can do with the heating and cooling system in this building, try to train some people in green technology, make sure that then any Hudson developments that come have to have green workforce and fossil fuel free. That's all I'm trying to do now, is just how do we just do tiny practical steps to address the inequality of humans and the climate catastrophe / power hungry systems that have drained us. And so I feel like what's exciting is I'm happy you went to there, Kari, because that to me is where I am at as an individual and where I'm excited to be at in Hudson. And hearing the both of you speak, you know, the 10th Academy, when you're ready to take people like me for a student, I am ready. You know, if you need a podium to speak or gather your students, we have a gigantic space. So that is, you know, what I'm most excited about this conversation, is that I learned more about you. David and Ellen, the generosity of spirit that both of you have, and I'm so happy someone's committed to visual arts in this conversation, and Jonah with organizing big, you know, citywide art festivals. You know, we're all are going to play our part in making what I believe is going to be a much better Hudson than it was 10 years ago, and for the next 100 years for essentially the kids that are growing up in Hudson. That's all that matters. It's just right. Youth at this point for both our planet and our little neighborhoods. And that's why I have been excited about embarking on this conversation series. I just want to know who my peers are, how we can help each other, how we can amplify amplify each other's work. And I think we achieved that thanks to Sam pressing record on Zoom. We had we know each other better. And let's do it. Let's educate youth. I want to learn about everything the 10th magazine is going to be bringing to grownups and youth in Hudson. I'm excited. Maybe tell us a bit about your radio show while we have you with other people who are listening to audio, 10th Radio. Just tell us a bit where you find it.
Well, yes, you will find 10th Radio. Right now we go live every Friday from 7 to 9. We've already done 2 episodes. I don't know if Kyrie spoke about them a little earlier, but we Spark Radio, or the Spark of Hudson is our partner in this. And so just shout outs to the Spark of Hudson and all the great work that they're doing. We came in to create this radio program for them. And so the 10th Radio is also a part of that. The Spark Radio will be focusing on issues that really impact in the history of the Hudson community and the surrounding towns and municipalities. And then, so we'll be talking about mutual aid. We'll be talking about universal basic income. We will be talking about, opportunity zones, all of those different things, sustainability, food justice, all the hot topics that are in Hudson. And then 10th Radio will be focusing on all things Black and all things queer. Our next episode is going to be looking at the crisis in Ghana. I don't know if you have been following that story, but at the end of February, there was an LGBTQ center that had opened up in January, and it was raided by the police. So we want our motherland writers, is what we affectionately have called them, to tell their own stories. So we have some of our contributors who are based in Lagos, Nigeria, and Accra, Ghana. So we will be looking at the diaspora. And so that will be a big sort of global conversation around everything, environment, art, through the lens of Black queer folks. And so you'll be getting, there'll be several shows that will be coming on. We have one about African influence in classical music. We have a DJ set, a gentleman who's a scientist, but he's also a DJ. So he has this whole thing about mood and frequency. So that show will be coming up. So a lot more to come, and we hope you all will join in. And it only works if we do have an audience that joins in and listens. And that's how we can, again, build those bridges by telling our stories. And we want to hear yours too, because we all have something. Yeah.
True. David, I saw that you were going to jump in earlier. Have at it.
Yeah.
If you still have something to say, no pressure.
I was just one of the first people I met up here was the Linda Mussman, who runs TLC, Time and Space Limited, and I started. It's an ongoing project I call Hudson Portrait Project, where I've just been photographing people in Hudson for the past 3 years, and I asked her to if I could do a portrait of her and Claudia, her partner, and she said no. I had to prove myself first. This was at the beginning. And she said, everybody comes to Hudson and they're all like, what can Hudson do for me? I want to work with people who say, what can I do for Hudson? Paraphrasing JFK, right? And I think that was a hugely important lesson for me as a new guy in Hudson. But I found so many people, artists, chefs, a lot of chefs who have really turned up during the pandemic to work for Hudson, to work for other communities. And I put that as the banner on Hudson Art Fair when we launched. Hudson's been great to artists. Now we're helping Hudson, because one of the things Hudson Art Fair does is we take 25% of all the sales and they go to local causes, Operation Unite, Hudson, Friends of Hudson Youth, etc. And that giving back to the community. Don't you guys find so many people we meet in Hudson that they're all giving, they're all got something going on to give back? And I don't know, that never happened in the city. So that's a small town thing. And to Melissa's point about, I think you mentioned something early on about this being an experiment. If we can do it in Hudson, we can do it elsewhere. This is like what's the word? A pilot.
Pilot.
And we've seen massive failures of militaries failed to bring peace and harmony, religions failed to bring peace and harmony, communism, socialism failed to bring peace and harmony. But have you ever been to a Coldplay concert? 70,000 people in the same wavelength. Art and culture, we got a chance. We can make positive changes. And let's start with Hudson and just spread it out.
I have that brings me to a line of inquiry I was going to bring in at this point, which is that this is something I've talked about a few times on the pod, and I like to kind of generally bounce this off people because it's a theory I'm working on. What's going on in Hudson? A lot of different perspectives have been advanced in this conversation, but what I think is undeniable is that there's a really authentic energy with momentum that's generative for everybody who's been a part of this call, at least, and I know for sure for many, many more people, right? And it feels very like I said, authentic and kind of like I don't like the word pure, but you know what I mean, kind of like a basic impulse of just something creative that just really feels kind of directly creative, divorced from all that transactional stuff and everything that you were talking about earlier at the beginning of the show. So I wonder if this is something that's happening in Hudson, but that's also uniquely possible in smaller towns, more minor markets right now. If in America, I'm talking about, if there isn't something that's been happening at the sort of nexus of like hyper capitalism and the internet and the culture of sponsorship and like mega events and everything needing to be lit all the time whenever you're in a major market, that's kind of burning out cities' receptors for this kind of work. My experience traveling around when I was allowed to do that is that I encountered this kind of energy more in smaller markets. But being folks who are up in a spot that's, you know, not where I am in New York City, what do you think? What do you think of the theory I'm working on here? Does that ring true to you, or what?
I think it speaks to what Melissa said earlier, which is in a small town, you can make a difference. Something that you do, you see the ripple effects, which it's much harder in a big city. And when you do something and it actually affects change, you're motivated to do more. And I think it feeds on itself.
And the social, you know, the lack of transaction thing, and that you really do all your neighbors, you see them, you're with them, you see them every day. But I've been, since the moment I got off the road of 15 years of major global cities, and fell kind of out of love with Montreal and New York, which were my two home, and my calling to Hudson was, and I've been saying for years, and I'm actually participating in a conference about this at the end of April. It's the future of America is in these small cities. There's no question. There's an organization called Future of Small Cities Institute up in Troy, and I'm doing a breakout session on the Sustainable Futures Conference, where they're going to speak specifically about municipalities and art's impact on the economics. And Rebecca Wolf, first alderman of Hudson, and I are walking a group of people through what she and I, as neighbors, before she was an elected official, she's a poet, a writer, a publisher. I'm a musician / founder of a space. And she and I for years has just been talking about how do we make these these actual changes on just an infrastructure level in Hudson. And the future of small cities is where I want to be. and everything we do in Hudson, I'm hoping, and in fact, a bunch of Basilica's sort of mission shift is to be a incubator and a resource for other small municipalities to leverage arts, culture to make change on climate and social inequities. That's like really what we want to do, based on the fact that we are a nexus and we have a blueprint that we could, and that we're improving our blueprint to be able to pass on to other municipalities, small cities in particular. I don't think you can do the work that we're all talking about doing in a big city. It's next to impossible, down to the fact that the elected officials, every single elected official right now, a city representative, have never been in politics before. So you can't have that in New York City. You can't have older people and city councilors that are just poets walking off the streets wanting to change things. That's impossible. So that's your answer is yes, you are correct. That could happen where you are. And I know you're thinking about moving upstate, so do it.
Also, if you wouldn't mind sharing the information on the conference that you and Rebecca.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
That's something that
Yeah. Yes. And you should be part of the next one. I mean, like the whole point is these are really starting in kind of climate economic conversations, but we all know it expands into these everything. So yes, I will be sharing that. In fact, the month of April will be Basilica's Green Month, where we're doing all kinds of conversations and participating in other organizations or conversations. So all of April, the Basilica will be a resource of a lot of exciting stuff is happening in New York State with big policy changes and bills that are trying to be passed. We're going to be informing a lot about green. There's one particular one that I know everyone on this call would love and that I urge you to go look at later. It's called the Climate Community Investment Act that is being considered right now, which is the first and most progressive bill in the country that is specifically get off fossil fuels, I think it's 40% of that money to put into communities in need. It's a very particular, it's finally like social and climate as one big act. And we are becoming, Basilica's just become a member of New York Renews who crafted this policy. They're policy makers. And it's really exciting what's happening in New York State, in particular, connecting climate and social equity. So that's where I feel like you're talking about, Sam, the momentum and the fact that a city of our size could start doing practical things in our city that educates things on big policy changes that could really change everybody's life. So that to me is the most exciting thing happening in my world and why I want to make sure we're all talking.
But wouldn't that be amazing if we all get behind, if we all in our own space, use our spaces together behind that piece of legislation?
Yes,
and
that's
do
what we're trying,
an art show around it, a magazine issue around it, speaking at the, speakers at the Basilica, another podcast. But if we all kind of join together and spread the word that we need to back this particular legislation, looking for focus. I'm
going to send you all that because we're actually, as a citizen, I'm starting the Hudson Environmental Action Alliance next month. Just me and Rebecca Wolf as individuals, because I don't want it to be Basilica. I don't want it to be an institution. As a citizen, I'm launching it. And the first thing we're doing is asking Basilica to host a lobby with our assembly person to review this bill. And through that, we are going to literally inform every one of you who joins the call, because everyone from Hudson, because I'm looking at it as a way to get everyone in Hudson who cares about these things to learn about the bill and get behind it and have peaceful communication rallies around it and all that. So yes, that is, that's kind of what I hoped all of these conversations will go to, is we just have to change the structure we're living in. And yes, we also need art and love and fun for sure, but we need to change the structure. And I think we're in a really exciting place, again, as a Canadian and I'm very aware of like Canadian blind spots, but I think the Hudson Valley, and with the types of cares and concerns that I have, I feel like I'm in the right place to be part of a big movement of change. I believe the Hudson Valley can do it and can lead the country. And that's why I was excited to bring Sam on a journey of the Hudson Valley, is that I believe that the movement can explode from this place, from this region. And thanks to a little like cog, pod, whatever we are, Hudson can be part of that. And I am grateful to have you generous, intelligent people alongside. Thank you.
It's a really interesting point that I mean, this is so straightforward, and perhaps it's my own short-sightedness that has allowed this to elude me, but that change is possible at this scale. because hearing this conversation and there's this kind of fluency with local politics and stuff, running a club in New York, I have to deal with the community board. I go to community board meetings sometimes and whatnot. Do you know what I mean? And I know for sure no one else I know goes to those meetings.
Right.
You know what I mean? And like, I'm not going to say 100% across the board. I do know examples of activist groups and, who go and do this stuff, but certainly in the general flow of like creative life in New York City, doing business as a creative professional. If I say I'm going out to CB5 community board, I'd bet the rent they don't know where that meeting is. Do you know what I mean? And it's interesting. It's an incongruence that hadn't occurred to me before, that there is this heightened level of engagement with local politics.
That is for sure.
For sure.
Because that's something that around here, people, people don't think about it. They're not like, you know what, I don't like X, I'm going to go to this meeting. It's just not part of people's life here. Anyways, that just for me is an interesting takeaway, and the issue about scale.
And that's how we're going to wrap the place of assembly, is the small city of Hudson. And there's a reason why we've assembled here, is the scale. And that's without a doubt. And the dynamic, diverse history in the current population. That's also, the microcosm of America on this scale is quite rare. Like a lot of the other small cities do not have this level of like historic and people diversity. It's pretty particular. It can't exist everywhere like this. I don't think moving to all small cities would be like this, but this is, that's what makes Hudson kind of magic, for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
Because it is such a perfect microcosm. If we can do it here, then we can do it in the macro.
Amazing. Well, this, I think, I think we've come to a good place. I don't want to foreclose on any closing comments, any other ideas. I'm here for it. But if everybody's said their piece, then I think we've covered a lot of ground and got to a good place.
If we had beers, we could go another hour.
Well, I'll be up there soon, so I'm here for it. Well, guys, thank you all so much for being a part of this conversation. Being on Place of Assembly, and I will shout out everybody when I'm in Hudson.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Whoa, intense vibes.
Well, mainly, we could have done an episode per organization, and I actually would have really liked that. But I guess for this conversation and this experience I was hoping to sort of see the odd overlaps and then the sometimes not at all overlapping drives and happenings of each organization. So I learned a lot. I makes me want to do work with all three organizations and to learn more about how we can work together to make these sort of future small cities reflect everything we just talked about in that conversation, which is how different everybody's perspective is, how different everybody's story is, how different everyone's experience is. And somewhere in there, arts and humanity link us together. And we're lucky enough to live in this little city of Hudson where we might be able to amplify and support each other. But I saw that as a really, just personally, I wanted to hear more, and in the context of others sharing what they do. I felt like that really changed the way that we shared what we do, because we were kind of bouncing off what the others do, as opposed to just being a silo of what they do. So I think that was I'm very satisfied in that. My work and commitment in Hudson is to learn more about how we can work together. And so that personally, I just hope that listeners and outsiders, Sam, that, some of it might have been a little like insular on the streets of Hudson, but I hope it was an interesting journey.
Yeah, no, there was a lot there. I mean, there were so many points where there were interesting takeaways and also interesting ways in which people diverged. I thought that the idea that conversation was possible, and then some pushback from you about you encountering a space 10 years ago where you felt that conversation was often foreclosed upon, and yet that divergence happening in the context of a conversation. Also, the bit about change being possible in small towns, and then the incredibly interesting and nuanced discussion of notions of resources and access and autonomy. All super powerful takeaways. Gave me a lot to think about, and I'm excited to do that.
Yes, and we'll see you in Hudson soon, Sam.
Well, yeah, this is our farewell on the pod. You've been amazing. Thank you so much, and yes, see you soon in Hudson.
Yeah, and let's do it again. Let's find another place to journey to together in the future on the conversation.
Canada, it's gonna happen.
Yes, it's good.
Okay, all right, bye.
Bye.